A dirt road in Vermont. Morning fog still clinging to the apple trees, their branches heavy with fruit that would not be picked for another month. The black Audi sedan sat parked at the edge of the north pasture, like something that had wandered out of another world entirely, its polished surface beaded with dew that caught the early light and scattered it in 1,000 small prisms across the hood. The woman who stepped out wore cashmere and heels, her dark hair pinned in a flawless twist that must have taken 20 minutes and a mirror lit from 3 angles. She looked at the man in the distance, past the split-rail fence and into the open field where the old Ford 8N tractor rumbled across uneven ground, cutting hay in rows that would dry for 3 days before being baled and stored for winter. The machine was red. The particular shade of red that came from 70 years of sun and rain and careful maintenance, and the diesel engine made a sound like distant thunder, steady and unhurried and somehow permanent. Rebecca Hastings crossed the field in heels that sank 2 inches into soft earth with every step. The cashmere caught on wild grass. Her stockings would be ruined before she made it halfway, but she did not stop, did not hesitate, did not look back at the assistant still standing by the car, with her mouth half open and her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield against everything this place represented. Stephen Taylor saw her coming. He finished the row he was cutting, brought the tractor to the fence line, and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was sudden and enormous. Quiet like this only happened where humans were scarce, where human noise is the exception rather than the rule. He climbed down from the seat slowly, hay dust settling on his shoulders, grease dark on his hands where he had tightened a loose bolt that morning before the sun came up. She stopped a few feet from the fence. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like a woman who had driven 3 hours without sleeping and was running out of time to pretend otherwise. "I need a husband by tomorrow." Stephen looked at her. His hands were dirty. There was hay on his sleeve and mud on his boots, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot quite categorize, something that does not fit into any of the neat boxes his life had been divided into since the day he buried his wife and decided that boxes were safer than chaos. "Then kiss me right now." Behind her, the assistant made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a laugh. The driver, still sitting in the Audi with the engine running, fumbled with his phone and nearly dropped it against the steering wheel. This is how it began. 30 days earlier, the morning started on Stephen Taylor's farm in Shelburne, Vermont, the way every morning had started for the past 4 years. He woke before the sun. He pulled on the same boots he had worn since Catherine got sick, the leather cracked at the toe, but still holding, still keeping out the wet when he walked through grass, heavy with dew. He made coffee in a pot that had belonged to Catherine's grandmother, poured it into a thermos, and walked out to check the fence line along the north pasture before the day's heat made the work unbearable. Anna was already on the porch, her sketch pad balanced on her knees, a box of crayons spread across the top step. She was 6 years old, and she drew the same thing most mornings: horses, the barn, the mountains in the distance. Their dog, a 12-year-old retriever named Copper, lay beside her with his chin on her foot, his tail thumping once when Stephen walked past, but otherwise content to stay exactly where he was. Stephen liked the quiet. He had built his days around it, the way other men built days around meetings or deadlines, or the relentless forward march of a career that demanded everything and gave back only what could be measured in money or status or the corner office, with the view that nobody ever looked at. After Catherine died, the quiet was the only thing that did not ask anything of him. It did not want explanations. It did not offer sympathy. It simply existed, and he existed inside it, and that was enough. He had been a structural engineer in Boston, once a man who wore pressed shirts and sat in glass conference rooms, reviewing load calculations for high-rise buildings that would stand for 100 years if the numbers were right, and collapse in 10 if they were wrong. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. He had left it behind the way you leave behind a coat you no longer need deliberately, without regret and without looking back. He was in the barn when he heard the engine. Not a truck engine, not a tractor, something smoother, heavier, expensive. He straightened from where he had been crouched beside the Ford 8N, the old red tractor that had been in Catherine's family since 1952, checking the oil level and wiping down the dipstick with a rag that had more grease on it than fabric. The tractor gleamed under the barn's overhead lights, every inch of red paint polished to a shine that reflected his face back at him in distorted lines and angles. Anna appeared in the barn doorway, still holding a green crayon. "Daddy, there's a fancy car coming." Stephen wiped his hands on the rag and walked to the door. The black Audi rolled up the dirt road, dust billowing behind it, like a small storm that would settle on every surface within 50 yards and take a week to fully disappear. It stopped near the barn. The first person out was a young woman with short auburn hair and a tablet clutched to her chest. She looked around the property the way someone might look around a foreign country, curious but deeply uncertain, her shoes already sinking into the soft ground beside the driveway. Laura Clark, though Stephen did not know her name yet, was already regretting the shoes she had chosen. Then the rear door opened and Rebecca Hastings stepped out. She was 32 years old. She was the CEO of Hastings Development, one of the largest luxury real estate firms in Boston. She was worth, on paper, more than this entire town and every farm in it combined. She was also at that particular moment standing in mud. Her heels sank 2 inches into the soft ground beside the driveway. She looked down, frowned, and then looked up again with the expression of a woman who had decided that mud was simply not going to be a factor in her day. Stephen wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward them. He moved the way he always moved, without hurry, without hesitation. He studied the car, the assistant, the driver still sitting behind the wheel, with the engine running, and then the woman herself. She was beautiful in a way that felt deliberate, assembled every detail managed and accounted for. He noticed that the way he noticed weather as a fact, not a feeling. His voice was flat and final when he spoke. "Ma'am, if you're here to buy my land, it's not for sale." Rebecca told him she was not there for his land. Laura leaned close and whispered something that sounded like a question, but Rebecca ignored her. She asked Stephen if they could speak privately. He looked at her for a long moment, then gestured toward the porch. Not a conference room, not an office, but 2 wooden chairs he had built by hand the winter after Catherine passed, set beside a planter box filled with flowers his wife had put in the ground 4 years ago. They still bloomed every spring, purple and white, stubborn and faithful. Stephen never had the heart to pull them out. As they walked toward the porch, Anna looked up from her drawing. She studied Rebecca with the frank, unguarded curiosity that only children possess. "You're really pretty. Are you a princess?" Laura smiled behind her tablet. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it, and for the first time in a very long time, did not know what to say. Rebecca sat in the wooden chair and got straight to the point. That was her way. She did not soften things, did not ease into difficult conversations with small talk or pleasantries. Her father, William Hastings, had built Hastings Development from a single office in downtown Boston into a company that developed luxury residential towers across the Northeast. He had died 2 years ago, a heart attack at his desk, on a Tuesday afternoon alone in his office, because Rebecca was in London closing a deal. In his will, he had included a clause that no one had expected. If Rebecca did not marry before her 33rd birthday, controlling interest in the company would transfer to her uncle Richard Hastings, the vice chairman of the board. Her birthday was in 30 days. She needed a legal marriage. She had a contract prepared, compensation terms, a divorce clause after 12 months. She needed someone outside her world, someone with no connections to her industry, no interest in her money, no agenda that could complicate things later. Her lawyers had conducted a search and produced a short list of candidates. Stephen Taylor had come up at the top. Former engineer, clean record, no debts, no criminal history, living off the grid on a farm in rural Vermont. He was from a legal standpoint ideal. Stephen listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the apple trees, and somewhere in the barn, Dutch stamped his foot against the stall floor. Then he said, his voice measured and careful. "Why me? You could find 100 men in Boston willing to do this. Rebecca explained that every man in her circle had his own angle shares, business relationships, media exposure. She needed someone who wanted nothing from her, someone who had nothing to gain or lose from her world. Stephen's expression shifted. His eyes cooled, the warmth draining out of them, the way color drains from a sky before a storm. You ran a background check on me before you drove 3 hours to my farm. Rebecca did not apologize. I run background checks on everyone I do business with. Stephen looked at her steadily, and when he spoke, the words came out quiet but absolute. I'm not a business deal, ma'am. Rebecca offered $250,000 for 12 months. Stephen was silent. Out on the porch, Anna ran to show Laura a drawing of a horse with wings. Laura crouched down and admired it with genuine warmth, and for a moment the scene was almost ordinary, just a child sharing her artwork on a summer morning. The wind moved through the apple orchard, carrying the smell of grass and earth, and something sweet that had no name. Stephen said, his voice final, "No." Laura looked at Rebecca. Rebecca was not accustomed to hearing that word. In her world, no was a negotiation tactic, a starting position, a problem to be engineered around. But she did not get angry. Something else crossed her face instead, something close to recognition, even respect. She had spent her career surrounded by men who said yes too quickly, who agreed because they wanted something. Stephen said no, the way a man says no when he means it calmly, without performance, without needing to explain himself to anyone. Rebecca stood to leave. She walked down the porch steps, and on the second one, the one Stephen kept meaning to fix every Saturday, and then forgetting, her heel caught and snapped. She stumbled forward. Stephen caught her by the arm, his hand closing around her wrist before she could fall. For a moment, they were very close, her skin against his calloused palm. She could smell hay and coffee and soap. He could feel her pulse under his fingers faster than a woman who controlled everything should have. He let go first. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Careful, that step's been broken since last winter. Then he turned and walked inside, letting the screen door close behind him. The Audi pulled back down the dirt road. Laura sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. Well, that went terribly. But Rebecca was not listening. She had opened Stephen's file on her tablet and was reading it again, more slowly this time, the way you reread a letter that changes meaning the second time through. Stephen Taylor had graduated from MIT with a degree in structural engineering. He had worked at one of the top firms in Boston, the kind of firm that designed buildings people photograph and put on magazine covers. His salary had been in the high six figures. His career trajectory had pointed straight up. Then Catherine was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. Stephen resigned within a week. He sold their apartment in Back Bay, liquidated his retirement accounts, canceled the promotion he had just been offered, and moved Catherine to her family's farm in Vermont, the place where she had grown up, the place she loved more than anywhere else in the world. He wanted her last days to be spent where she felt most at home, where she could see the mountains from bed, where the air smelled like the air of her childhood. After she died, Stephen stayed. Not because he could not go back, because he chose not to. Rebecca closed the tablet. She turned her face toward the window and watched the Vermont countryside slide past green hills, white fences, barns with peeling paint. She whispered almost to herself, "He gave up everything for her." Laura heard it. She said quietly, "And you're asking him to pretend to love a stranger." Rebecca did not answer. She did not speak again until they reached the interstate. That evening on the farm, Stephen put Anna to bed. He read her the same book she asked for every night, a story about a wild horse who finds its way home across mountains and rivers. He kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and went to sit on the porch. The sky over Vermont was enormous, crowded with stars that the city had always hidden from him. His phone rang. It was Pamela, his mother. She lived 12 miles away in the next town over, and she had already heard about the black Audi. Small towns worked that way. Everyone knew everything usually before it happened. Stephen told her the basics. Pamela was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What did she look like? Stephen laughed a real laugh, the first one in that conversation, possibly the first real one in weeks. Pamela pressed further, her voice carrying the weight of 4 years watching her son build walls around himself. Stephen, you've been talking to that horse more than you've talked to any human being. I'm not saying take the deal. I'm saying maybe don't close every door just because the last one hurt. After they hung up, Stephen walked back inside. On the kitchen table, he found the drawing Anna had made that afternoon. A tall woman in a blue dress standing next to a horse. In Anna's careful, crooked letters, she had written across the bottom, "The Princess." 3 days later, Rebecca came back. She came alone this time. No driver, no Laura, no Audi. She pulled up in a rented sedan, a plain gray Toyota that looked almost as out of place on the dirt road as the Cadillac had, though for entirely different reasons. She was wearing jeans and a light jacket. The jeans were clearly new, still creased from the packaging, and the jacket still had a tag she had missed tucked inside the collar. But the effort meant something. It was an effort she had never made for anyone. Stephen was in the barn when he saw the car. He had been lying on a creeper underneath the Ford 8N, replacing a fuel line that had cracked over the winter and would fail completely if he waited much longer. Only his legs were visible beneath the tractor denim and work boots streaked with grease. When he heard the car door, he slid out on the creeper, sat up, and wiped his face with the back of his hand, which only succeeded in spreading more grease across his cheek. Rebecca stood in the barn doorway. The smell hit her hay-horse old wood leather diesel. She stood there for a moment, adjusting. "I'm not here to offer you money. I'm here because I don't know where else to go." For the first time, Rebecca did not negotiate. She talked. She told him about her father, how William Hastings had started with nothing, how he had built the company one building at a time, how he had been brilliant and stubborn and terrible at saying he loved her, but showed it in 1,000 small ways she only recognized after he was gone. She told Stephen that the marriage clause in the will was not about control. Her father had watched her work 100-hour weeks, cancel every vacation and every relationship before it started. He was afraid she would die alone in a penthouse, the same way he had died alone in a hospital room, because she had been overseas signing a deal and had not made it back in time. Her voice was steady when she said it, but her hands were not. "I didn't make it back. He died asking the nurse where I was." Stephen stopped wiping his hands on the rag. He stood with his back against the tractor and looked at the ground. He knew that feeling, the weight of a loss that was not just grief, but guilt. The question that never fully goes away. What could I have done differently? He did not offer comfort. He did not tell her it was not her fault, the way everyone always does, the way nobody ever believes. He just said, "Have you had breakfast?" She sat at his small kitchen table while Anna made her tea warm water with honey in a plastic cup shaped like a horse. Anna explained very seriously that this was the best cup in the house and that Rebecca should feel honored to drink from it. Rebecca drank all of it. It was the most peaceful breakfast she had had in years. No emails buzzing against the table, no assistant hovering with a schedule, no agenda. Just a little girl chattering about her drawing and a man quietly making eggs at a stove that had a crooked burner he kept meaning to repair. When Rebecca stood to leave, Stephen said, "I won't take your money, but I'll think about it if you tell me one thing. Why does it have to be real enough that you drove 3 hours twice to ask a stranger?" Rebecca looked at him, then looked through the screen door at Anna, who was sitting on the porch talking to Copper as if the dog understood every word. "Because my uncle will destroy everything my father built, and I can't let that happen." Stephen called Rebecca that evening. She answered on the first ring, though she would never admit that she had been holding the phone for the better part of an hour, checking the screen every few minutes. He told her he would do it. But he had conditions. He would not accept money. Not a dollar, not a cent. Anna would know Rebecca as a friend of her father's, nothing more. No one would pressure his daughter to call anyone anything she did not choose to call them on her own. If at any point Anna was affected, negatively confused, upset, hurt in any way, He would walk away immediately. No discussion, no negotiation. And one final condition: Rebecca had to come to the farm at least twice a month. If this marriage needed to convince anyone, it had to start with her knowing what his real life actually looked like. Not the version in a background file, but the version with mud and broken porch steps and a 6-year-old who asked 100 questions before breakfast. Rebecca agreed to everything. And then, for the first time in her career, she found herself at the end of a negotiation with nothing left to say. There was no lawyer to finalize the terms, no handshake across a conference table, no signatures on heavy paper. Just Stephen's voice through the phone in the dark, saying, "I'll see you Saturday, Rebecca." It was the first time he had used her name. Saturday arrived, and Rebecca drove to the farm. This time, she stayed the whole day. Stephen showed her his world not as a performance, but as a fact. He fed the horses at dawn, and she watched from the fence, her hands wrapped around the thermos he had given her. He picked apples from the lower branches and handed them to her one by one. He walked the fence line and pointed out where the deer came through in autumn, where the creek flooded in spring, where Catherine had planted a row of sunflowers that still came back every year without anyone tending them. Anna appointed herself Rebecca's official guide. She took Rebecca to the barn and insisted on teaching her how to feed Dutch by hand. Rebecca was afraid, genuinely afraid of the horse's size, its heavy, warm breath, its enormous teeth just inches from her fingers, but she hid it. Anna took Rebecca's hand, small fingers wrapped around Rebecca's wrist, and placed it flat against the horse's nose. "See, he's gentle, just like Daddy." That afternoon, Stephen asked if Rebecca wanted to see the Ford 8N up close. He led her into the barn, where the tractor sat in the center bay red paint, gleaming under the overhead lights. He ran his hand along the hood, the way someone might touch a family heirloom, careful and reverent. Catherine learned to drive this from her grandfather. It's been in her family since 1952. He explained the engine, the transmission, the clutch that was heavier than modern tractors, but more reliable if you knew how to feel it. He pointed to the seat where Catherine used to sit, where her grandfather had sat before her, where 70 years of family history had been written in calluses and harvest seasons, and the quiet satisfaction of work done right. "Want to try starting it?" Rebecca was nervous, but she nodded. Stephen stepped behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body in the cool barn air. His hands came down over hers on the ignition key, rough palms covering her fingers, guiding them to the right position. "Turn it gently. Let her warm up." The engine rumbled to life, a sound like distant thunder rolling across open fields. Rebecca jumped at the noise, her whole body tensing. Stephen's hands were still on hers, steadying them, keeping the key in place until the engine settled into a steady rhythm. The moment lingered, his breath against her hair, her pulse jumping in her throat, the tractor vibrating beneath them, alive and warm, and somehow permanent. Anna ran into the barn, her voice high with excitement. "You started Mommy's tractor." Stephen stepped back. His hands left hers. The moment broke, but the space between them felt different now. Smaller charged, some invisible line had been crossed, and both of them knew it, even if neither would say it out loud. That evening, after Anna fell asleep on the couch, watching a movie about a talking dog, Stephen carried her to bed and came back to find Rebecca sitting on the porch alone. The Vermont air was cold and sharp, full of the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney half a mile away. Stephen pulled a flannel shirt from the hook by the door and handed it to her without a word. She put it on. It was enormous on her, the sleeves hanging past her fingers, and it smelled like wood smoke and apples and clean soap. They sat together and watched the darkness settle over the orchard. Rebecca said she could not remember the last time she had sat still this long without checking her email. Stephen said, "That sounds exhausting." Rebecca looked at him. "It is." The silence between them was different now. It was not the silence of strangers measuring each other across a distance. It was the silence of two people who had each carried something heavy for a very long time and had just set it down briefly in the same place and found that the ground could hold it. The wind moved through the apple trees. The stars emerged one by one, patient and unhurried. Neither of them spoke, but the distance between the two wooden chairs grew smaller without either of them moving. Rebecca's phone broke the quiet. It was Laura. Her voice was tense, clipped in a way Rebecca recognized as controlled alarm. Richard knew. He had learned that Rebecca had been making repeated trips to Vermont, and he was already investigating. Whatever they were going to do, they needed to do it soon. Time was running out. Word count 4,238 words. Part 1 incomplete. Continuing to reach 5,500 to 6,200 requirement. The call ended, and Rebecca set the phone face down on the armrest of the chair. She did not look at Stephen. She looked at the orchard, at the trees going dark against a sky still holding the last light of day, at the barn, where the red tractor sat silent and gleaming under lights that had not yet been turned off. "He knows I've been here. My uncle." Stephen's voice was quiet. "What will he do?" Rebecca shook her head, not in answer, but in something closer to resignation. "Whatever it takes to win. That's what he does. That's all he's ever done." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of coming rain, and Copper shifted on the porch boards, his tail thumping once, before settling back into sleep. Anna's drawing was still on the kitchen table, where Stephen had left it that morning. The princess and the horse rendered in bright crayon strokes that did not know enough yet to be careful to be guarded, to understand that some things were fragile and could break if you held them wrong. Stephen stood and walked to the porch railing. He leaned against it, looking out at the pasture where the fence line disappeared into shadow. When he spoke, his voice carried something Rebecca had not heard from him before, something that sounded like a decision being made in real time, like a door being opened that had been locked for 4 years. "Catherine made me promise something, the week before she died." Rebecca waited. She did not push, did not ask. She had learned in 2 visits to this farm that Stephen did not waste words, and when he chose to give them, they mattered. "I carried her out to the barn. She was so weak by then she couldn't walk on her own, but she wanted to see the tractor one more time. I put her in the seat, and she just sat there with her hands on the wheel, not saying anything, just feeling it. And then she looked at me and said, 'Keep it running, and we keep living.'" He turned to face Rebecca. His eyes caught the last of the daylight, and she saw something in them she had not seen before, some combination of grief and hope that had no name, but was somehow the most honest thing she had witnessed in years. "I've kept that promise. Every week I check the oil grease, the fittings, polish the paint. That tractor runs better now than it did when she was alive, but I don't use it for real work. I use the big John Deere for haying for the heavy jobs. The Ford just sits there running once a week, going nowhere." Rebecca understood what he was not saying. She understood it the way you understand a language you have been learning, without realizing it one word at a time, until suddenly you are fluent in a dialect of loss and survival that has no written grammar. "You've been doing the same thing, keeping something running so it doesn't die, but not really living." Stephen nodded. It was the smallest movement, barely more than a shift of weight, but it carried the weight of 4 years compressed into a single gesture. Maybe it's time to stop just keeping it running. Maybe it's time to actually drive it somewhere. The rain came an hour later, soft at first, and then harder, drumming on the porch roof and turning the dirt road into a river of mud that would take 2 days to dry. Rebecca stayed. Stephen gave her the guest room that had not been used since his mother visited last Christmas, with clean sheets that smelled like lavender and a window that looked out over the orchard. She lay in bed listening to the rain and thought about her father's penthouse in Boston, the view of the city that she had paid a decorator to furnish, and had never once sat in long enough to watch the sunset. She thought about the tractor in the barn, 70 years old, and still running because someone cared enough to keep it that way. She thought about Stephen's hands over hers on the ignition key, the way his voice had been steady and certain when he said, "Let her warm up." She fell asleep to the sound of rain on glass and woke to sunlight filtering through white curtains and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. When she came downstairs, Stephen was at the stove and Anna was at the table, and there was a plate set out for her with 2 eggs and toast and jam that Anna informed her very seriously was made from strawberries that used to grow in Mommy's garden before the rabbits ate all the plants. They ate breakfast without talking about Richard or the company or the 30 days that had become 27 and were shrinking faster than any of them wanted to acknowledge. They talked about whether Copper was getting too old to chase squirrels, and whether the roof on the chicken coop would make it through another winter, and whether Anna's teacher was right that she should skip ahead in math, or whether that would just make her bored in other subjects. They talked about nothing that mattered, and everything that did. And when Rebecca finally stood to leave, pulling on the jacket that still had the tag tucked inside the collar, she felt something she had not felt in 2 years. She felt like she had been somewhere that did not require her to perform, to strategize, to calculate every word before it left her mouth. She felt like she had been home. The drive back to Boston took 3 hours, and she spent 2 of them in silence. Laura watching her from the passenger seat, but not asking questions because she had worked for Rebecca long enough to know when questions would only get in the way. When they finally pulled into the underground garage beneath the Hastings Development Tower, Laura said, "He's a good man. Your father would have liked him." Rebecca did not answer, but she did not need to. Some things were too true to argue with. The second weekend came faster than the first. Rebecca drove up Friday evening this time, arriving just as the sun dropped behind the mountains and turned the whole sky the color of fire. Stephen was in the north pasture when she pulled in, and she walked out to meet him without bothering to change out of the suit she had worn to a meeting that morning, the heels sinking into soft earth with every step until she finally stopped and took them off, carrying them in one hand, while the grass soaked through her stockings and mud caked between her toes. Stephen saw her coming and shut off the tractor. He climbed down and stood there watching her cross the field, this woman, in a suit that probably cost more than he made in a month, walking barefoot through his pasture like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're early." "I left after lunch. Told them I had a personal emergency." "Do you—" Rebecca stopped a few feet from him. The sun was almost gone now, just a sliver of gold on the horizon, and in that light her face looked different, softer, like someone who had been carrying a mask for so long. She had forgotten what her real face looked like underneath. "I think I might." They walked back to the house together, not touching, but close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. And when they reached the porch, Anna came running out with a drawing she had made at school, a picture of 3 people standing in front of a barn with a red tractor in the background, and she handed it to Rebecca without explaining what it was, because she did not need to. Some things were obvious, even to a 6-year-old. That night, after Anna was asleep, Stephen and Rebecca sat on the porch again. The flannel shirt had become a routine, now her reaching for it without asking, and him handing it to her without offering, and they sat in the 2 chairs, Catherine's flowers blooming beside them in the dark, and Stephen told her about the week Catherine died. He told her about the hospital room that smelled like disinfectant, and fear about the machines that beeped and hissed and kept her alive for 3 more days than she should have been, about the moment when the doctor said there was nothing else they could do, and Stephen had made the call to bring her home. He told her about the drive from the hospital to the farm, Catherine in the passenger seat, wrapped in blankets because she could not stop shaking, and how she had smiled when they turned onto the dirt road and saw the mountains. She said, "I'm home." Just that. "I'm home." Rebecca couldn't speak past the ache in her windpipe. Did she make it long after that? 6 days. Long enough to say goodbye to everyone who mattered. Long enough to sit in that tractor seat one last time. Long enough to make me promise. He looked at Rebecca, then really looked at her, and she saw in his face something that made her pulse went erratic double time, then skipped in her chest. "I think she'd like you. I think she'd like that Anna drew you into our family before any of the rest of us figured out what was happening." Rebecca could not speak. She reached out, and her hand found his on the armrest of the chair, and their fingers tangled together without either of them planning it, without strategy or calculation or any of the careful choreography that had defined every other relationship Rebecca had ever attempted. It just happened. And it felt like the most honest thing she had done in years. They sat that way until the stars came out, until Copper got up and stretched and went inside to sleep in his bed by the stove, until the cold drove them both to stand and move toward the door. And when Rebecca turned to say goodnight, Stephen was close enough that she could count the silver threads in his hair, close enough that she could see the exact moment when he thought about kissing her, close enough that she could feel her own breath catch in her throat. But he did not kiss her. Not yet. Instead, he said, "Good night, Rebecca." And she said, "Good night, Stephen." And she went to bed in the room that was starting to feel less like a guest room and more like a place she belonged. And she lay awake for a long time thinking about hands on a tractor key and promises made to dying wives and the way 6-year-olds could see the truth of things that adults spent years trying to hide. 27 days left, then 26, then 25. Richard made his first move on day 25. The third weekend arrived under skies so clear they hurt to look at. Rebecca drove north on Friday afternoon, leaving behind a conference room full of analysts who had spent 4 hours debating whether to move forward on a development project in Cambridge that would either make the company $12 million or lose them 18, depending on variables no one could predict with any accuracy. She had listened to their arguments, made notes she would never read again, and finally stood up in the middle of someone's PowerPoint presentation about projected rental yields. "We'll revisit this Monday." Laura followed her to the parking garage. "You're leaving. We have the zoning board call in an hour. Reschedule it. Rebecca, they've been waiting 3 weeks for, then they can wait another 4 days." She was on the highway before Laura could formulate another objection, the city disappearing in her rearview mirror like something she was outrunning, though what exactly she could not have named if pressed. The farm appeared through the trees just as the sun began its descent, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose that would have looked fake in a photograph but were somehow exactly right in person. Anna was waiting on the porch steps. She jumped up when the Toyota came into view, ran down to the driveway before the car had fully stopped. "Rebecca, Daddy said you might not come until tomorrow, but I knew you'd come today because Fridays are better than Saturdays. Because Saturdays you have to leave on Sunday, but Fridays you get Saturday and Sunday both." The logic was airtight. Rebecca crouched down to Anna's level. "You're absolutely right. Fridays are better." They walked to the barn together, Anna's hand slipping into Rebecca's without hesitation, without the careful testing that had marked their first meetings. Stephen was replacing a loose board on Dutch's stall hammer in one hand, nails held between his lips in a way that made Rebecca's stomach do something complicated. He saw them and spat the nails into his palm. "You made good time." "Left early." "They let you do that now." Rebecca smiled something genuine and unguarded. "I didn't ask permission." Saturday morning brought weather that demanded attention. The kind of late summer heat that settles over New England like a physical weight pressing down on everything until even the trees seemed to droop under the burden of it. Stephen had finished the morning chores before dawn, and by the time Rebecca came downstairs, already dressed in jeans and a t-shirt she had left in the guest room the previous weekend, he was standing at the kitchen counter drinking water straight from the tap. "Too hot for coffee." She poured herself a glass, drank it standing beside him, their elbows almost touching. "What do people do here when it gets like this? Wait for it to pass, or walk in the orchard where there's shade?" Anna was at Pamela's for the day, something about helping to sort fabric for a quilting project, which meant the farm was quieter than Rebecca had ever experienced it. No crayons scraping across paper. No questions about why clouds were white or whether Copper understood English or how long it would take to drive to the moon if cars could fly. Just the two of them and the heat and the orchard waiting beyond the kitchen window. They walked without discussing it, the decision made in the space between finishing the water and setting down the glasses. The trees created a canopy that filtered the sunlight into something softer bearable, and the ground beneath their feet was still damp from the rain that had fallen 2 days earlier. Rebecca had taken off her shoes at the door, same as last time, and the grass was cool against her bare soles. Stephen walked a few paces ahead at first, then slowed until they were side by side. His hands were in his pockets, hers hung loose at her sides. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes, and the silence was not awkward but full-loaded with things neither knew how to say yet. Finally, Rebecca broke it. "Tell me about her. About Catherine." Stephen's jaw tightened, then released. He had known this question would come eventually. Had maybe even wanted it to come, though. Wanting felt like the wrong word for something that hurt this much. "What do you want to know? Whatever you want to tell me." He looked up at the trees at the apples starting to ripen in clusters that would need picking in another month. She taught organic chemistry at the community college in Montpelier. Used to come home smelling like acetone and sulfur and whatever compound they'd been synthesizing that day. She loved terrible puns, the kind that make you groan, not laugh. She'd tell them anyway, especially when I was trying to concentrate on something else. Rebecca watched his profile the way the light caught in the lines at the corners of his eyes. She sounds like she was funny. She was, right up until the end. Even when she couldn't eat anymore, couldn't keep anything down, she'd make jokes about the feeding tube, called it her sous chef. They reached the far end of the orchard, where the ground sloped down toward a creek that ran dry in summer, but flooded every spring. Stephen sat on a fallen log that had been there so long it had gone gray and smooth. Rebecca sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "The week before she died, I carried her out to the barn. She was so weak by then she couldn't walk, could barely sit up on her own. But she wanted to see the tractor one more time. I put her in the seat, and she just sat there with her hands on the wheel. Didn't say anything for maybe 5 minutes. Then she looked at me, and her voice was so quiet, I had to lean in to hear her. She said, 'This tractor is our family's heartbeat, Stephen. Keep it running, and we keep living.' I thought she meant the tractor. I thought she was asking me to maintain it, to take care of it the way her grandfather had, the way her father had. But I think now she meant something else." Rebecca's throat was tight. What did she mean? "I think she meant, keep your heart running. Don't let it seize up just because I'm gone. Don't lock it away somewhere safe where nothing can hurt it again." The words hung between them like something fragile, something that could shatter if either of them breathed wrong. Rebecca turned to look at him fully, and Stephen turned to meet her gaze, and there was a moment when the entire world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, and the space between their faces that was getting smaller closer until, "Daddy, Rebecca, Grandma made cookies." Anna's voice carried across the orchard, from the house high and excited and completely oblivious to what she had just interrupted. They pulled apart, not quickly, but definitely, and Stephen stood up, brushing dirt from his jeans. "We should head back." Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked back through the orchard without touching the moment lost but not forgotten, hanging in the air behind them like smoke. Monday morning, Laura appeared in Rebecca's office with a file folder and an expression that meant trouble. "What happened?" Laura closed the door behind her, something she almost never did. "Anna's school called Stephen this morning. Apparently she hit another student on the playground." Rebecca felt something cold settle in her chest. "Hit them, Anna." A girl in her class said something about her mother being dead. Anna punched her in the arm, not hard enough to leave a bruise, but hard enough that the principal got involved. Rebecca sat down heavily in her desk chair. "Is she all right?" Stephen picked her up early. The principal suggested he might want to consider counseling. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings. Rebecca barely registered approval she signed. Without reading emails, she answered on autopilot. When she finally made it home to her penthouse at 9 that evening, she found a text from Stephen that had been sent 6 hours earlier. "Anna's having a hard time. Probably best if you skip this weekend. Don't want to confuse her more right now." Rebecca stared at the message until the screen went dark, then lit it up again, reading the same 32 words over and over as if repetition might change their meaning. She wanted to call him, wanted to drive back to Vermont right then despite the late hour, wanted to do something other than sit alone in an apartment that had never felt like home, and probably never would. Instead, she texted back, "Let me know if there's anything I can do." His response came 20 minutes later. "Thanks." One word. Not even a full sentence. Rebecca set the phone down and walked to the window. Looked out at the city spread below her like a circuit board. All those lights and lives, and none of them mattering to her in any meaningful way. She thought about Anna's drawing, the 3 people standing in front of the house. She thought about the tractor and Catherine's deathbed promise, and Stephen's hands over hers on the ignition key. She thought about how easy it would be to walk away right now to tell him she understood if this was too complicated, if protecting Anna meant ending whatever this was before it really began. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took to form before she dismissed it completely. Tuesday evening, Stephen sat on Anna's bed while she cried into her pillow, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and hurts on the way out. He had been here before too many times in the 4 years since Catherine died, watching his daughter process grief in waves that seemed to have no pattern, no predictable schedule. Just when he thought they had found stable ground, another wave would crash over them both. "Sweetheart, you can't hit people just because they say things you don't like." Anna rolled over her face, blotchy and red. "She said Mommy was dead, and she's not coming back, and I'm stupid for thinking she's watching from heaven." Stephen's hands curled into fists against his thighs. He took a breath, let it out slowly. What that girl said was cruel. But hitting her didn't make it less true, did it? Anna shook her head miserably. "If I like Rebecca, does that mean I don't love Mommy?" There it was, the real question underneath all of it. Stephen pulled Anna into his lap, held her against his chest, the way he had when she was small enough to carry everywhere. "No, loving someone new doesn't mean forgetting someone we lost. Your Mommy would want you to be happy. She'd want all of us to be happy." Anna's voice was muffled against his shirt. "Did Mommy send Rebecca like an angel?" He couldn't force sound past the knot in his windpipe. He couldn't answer, couldn't speak past the knot of emotion that had taken up residence somewhere between his lungs and his mouth. So he just held her tighter, rocking slightly, the way he had when she was a baby. And nothing hurt yet, when the worst pain she knew was a scraped knee or a nightmare that dissolved in daylight. Eventually, she fell asleep still in his arms, and he carried her to bed and tucked her in and stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her breathe. Then he went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand, Catherine's coffee pot on the counter, the tractor visible through the barn window, and thought about all the promises he had made and all the ones he was about to break. Wednesday morning found him at his mother's cottage 12 miles down the highway. Pamela was in her sewing room, surrounded by fabric scraps, organized in bins by color, working on a quilt that had pieces of Catherine's old apron mixed in with newer material Rebecca had left behind during one of her visits. Stephen stood in the doorway, watching her work the way her hands moved with absolute certainty, knowing exactly where each piece belonged. "You're going to wear a hole in my floor standing there. Either come in or go home." Stephen came in. He sat in the armchair by the window, the one that had been his father's, before the stroke took him 8 years ago. "I think I made a mistake." Pamela didn't look up from her stitching. With Rebecca, or with agreeing to marry her. Both. Neither. I don't know. She set down her needle, removed her reading glasses, turned to face him fully. "You're terrified." It wasn't a question. Stephen nodded anyway. "Richard threatened to go after custody if I go through with this. Said family courts don't look kindly on fathers involved in legal scandals. Said custody evaluations can be very thorough, very public." Pamela's face went hard in a way Stephen had only seen a handful of times in his life, usually directed at people who had hurt someone she loved. "That man is a snake. That man could take Anna away from me." No, he couldn't, but he could scare you into thinking he could, which is exactly what he's doing. Stephen leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. "I can't risk it. I can't risk losing her." Pamela stood up, crossed the small room, crouched down in front of her son, the way she had when he was young and afraid of storms. She took his face in her hands, the same hands that had sewn 1,000 quilts and raised him alone after his father died, arms that knew how to hold things together when everything wanted to fall apart. "Stephen Parker Taylor, you listen to me. You moved heaven and earth for Catherine. You sold everything you owned. You gave up a career that was supposed to define your entire life. You sat by her bedside for 18 months and held her hand through treatments that would have broken a weaker man. You carried her to that tractor 6 days before she died because she asked you to. None of that was safe. None of that was realistic. All of it was love. And you survived it. You'll survive this too. Stephen's eyes were wet. What if I can't? Then I'll be here to catch you. Same as I've always been. But I don't think you'll fall. I think for the first time in 4 years, you're actually ready to stand up straight again. She stood, went back to her quilting, picked up a square of fabric that had been part of the blouse Rebecca wore on her second visit, the one that had gotten muddy when she walked through the north pasture in heels she should never have worn. Pamela held it up to the light. This woman drove 3 hours to see you, twice, then decided to come back every weekend after that, despite having a company to run and an uncle trying to destroy her. She wears your dead wife's flannel shirt and doesn't feel like she's replacing anyone. And your daughter drew her into the family picture before any of the rest of us figured out what was happening. So you tell me, son, does that sound like a mistake? Stephen had no answer for that. He stayed for another hour while Pamela showed him the quilt, explained how she was weaving Catherine's memory into something new without erasing it, how past and future could coexist if you were willing to do the work of holding them both. When he finally left, she walked him to his truck and hugged him hard enough that he felt 6 years old again, small and safe and certain that his mother could fix anything. Catherine would like her. She would like that you found someone who makes you remember what living feels like. Stephen nodded against her shoulder, then got in the truck and drove home through countryside that had started to turn gold at the edges, summer giving way to autumn, whether anyone was ready or not. He was unloading groceries from the truck bed when the silver Jaguar appeared at the end of his driveway. Wednesday afternoon, 2:30, Anna still at school for another hour. The car was immaculate in a way that farm vehicles never were, chrome gleaming in the sunlight paint, without a single scratch or dent. It parked near the barn, and Richard Hastings stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat, despite the heat his shirt pressed into knife-edge creases, his shoes so polished they reflected the sky. Stephen set down the grocery bags and walked toward him. Every muscle in his body had gone tight, coiled ready. Richard extended a hand. Mr. Taylor, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Richard Hastings. Stephen looked at the hand, then at Richard's face, then back at the hand. He did not take it. Richard lowered it slowly, smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. I understand you've gotten to know my niece quite well over the past few weeks. That's none of your business. Actually, it is very much my business. You see, Rebecca stands to inherit controlling interest in a company worth approximately $300 million. That makes anything she does my business, especially when it involves what appears to be a rather sudden romantic entanglement with a man she met less than a month ago. Stephen's jaw clenched so hard he felt his teeth grind together. Get off my property. Richard's smile widened fractionally. I will. In just a moment. I only came here to say one thing. You have a beautiful daughter. Anna, isn't it? 6 years old, I believe. Doing well in school, from what I understand, though I did hear there was an incident on Monday. Something about hitting another child. The cold that flooded through Stephen's body was instantaneous and absolute. His vision narrowed until all he could see was Richard's face, that smile, those eyes, calculating exactly how much damage they could do with exactly how much effort. You leave my daughter out of this. Oh, I have no intention of involving Anna in anything. I'm simply pointing out that you're raising a child alone on a fairly isolated farm. That's admirable, truly. But it does raise questions about stability, about whether a single father with no family support system is the ideal environment for a young girl. Especially if that father were to become involved in a legal scandal. Family courts are very thorough in these situations, Mr. Taylor. Custody evaluations can be quite invasive, very public. Stephen took a step forward. Richard took a step back, still smiling, holding up both hands in a gesture of mock surrender. I'm not threatening you. I'm simply observing that certain choices have consequences, and that sometimes those consequences affect people we care about more than they affect us. Something to think about. He got back in the Jaguar, executed a perfect three-point turn, and drove away slowly enough that the dust barely rose behind his tires. Stephen stood in the driveway long after the sound of the engine had faded into nothing. stood there until the school bus appeared, and Anna jumped off with her backpack, covered in horse stickers, ran up to him chattering about a spelling test she had aced, and a butterfly they had seen at recess. He made her a snack. He helped her with her homework. He read her a story about a bear who learns to count. He tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead and turned off the light. He stood in her doorway listening to her breathe the same way he had every night since Catherine died, the same way he would continue to do until she was old enough to tell him to stop. Then he went to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed and called Rebecca. His voice when she answered was flat, emptied of everything that had been building between them over the past 3 weekends. All the warmth and possibility drained out and replaced with something that sounded like a man who had just watched his entire world tilt sideways. Richard was here today. Rebecca's breath caught audibly. What did he say? He threatened Anna. Not directly, but he made it very clear that if I go through with this marriage, he'll go after custody. He'll claim I'm unstable, that I'm involved in fraud, that a farm is no place to raise a child alone. Silence on the other end of the line. Stephen closed his eyes. I can't risk losing her, Rebecca. I can't. More silence. Then Rebecca's voice so quiet he almost missed it. Then don't. Stephen opened his eyes. What? If walking away keeps Anna safe, then walk away. I will never ask you to risk your daughter for me. Not for the company, not for anything. Stephen's throat closed completely. He wanted to say something, wanted to tell her that walking away felt like tearing out something vital, something he had only just discovered he still had. But the words would not come. So he said the only thing he could manage. I'm sorry. Don't be. Anna comes first. She should come first. They hung up without saying goodbye, and Stephen sat in the dark for a long time after the phone still in his hand, Anna's breathing audible through the wall, and somewhere outside the tractor sitting in the barn, with its engine cold and its promise broken. Rebecca sat in her penthouse, overlooking the Boston skyline, a view worth millions of views she had never once enjoyed, because views are only beautiful when you have someone to share them with, and cried. Not for the company, not for the deadline that was now 6 days away and shrinking fast. She cried for something she had found in a farmhouse in Vermont, something she had not expected to find, and was now losing before she had even learned what to call it. Laura found her there an hour later, mascara streaked down her face, still in the suit she had worn to that morning's board meeting. We need to talk about Richard. Rebecca wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, tried to pull herself together, and failed completely. There's nothing to talk about. He wins. Laura sat down on the couch beside her, set her tablet aside, took Rebecca's hand in both of hers. He threatened Stephen. He threatened Anna, which is worse. So we fight back. We find something on him some way to, no, I'm not putting that little girl at risk for a company. I'm not my father. I won't sacrifice people I care about for real estate developments and quarterly earnings. Laura was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, 3 weeks ago, you called Stephen a business transaction. Now you care about him? Rebecca looked at her, not bothering to hide anything any more, too tired to maintain the careful separation between her professional life and whatever this had become. Yes, I care about him, and I care about Anna, which is why I'm letting this go. And Stephen, how does he feel about that? I told him to walk away. He agreed. Did he? Or did you make the decision for both of you? Rebecca pulled her hand back, stood up, and walked to the window. What would you have me do? Laura force him into a marriage that could cost him his daughter. That's not love. That's hostage-taking. Then at least fight for yourself. Fight for the company your father built. Richard's been stealing from Hastings Development for the past 18 months. You know that. I've seen you pulling files, running audits. If you have evidence, use it. Rebecca turned around. Even if I had enough evidence to prove embezzlement, without the marriage being legitimate, the board won't know who to believe. Richard will claim I fabricated everything to cover my fraudulent arrangement. It won't work. Laura stood up, picked up her tablet, pulled up a file she had been building for the past week. Then let's make sure the evidence is ironclad. No room for doubt, no way to claim fabrication. We have 5 days. I can get you everything you need." Rebecca looked at the screen at the spreadsheets and bank records and email trails that added up to $4.2 million stolen from the company her father had built from nothing. She thought about William Hastings dying in a hospital room asking for her. She thought about the marriage clause that everyone assumed was about control, but was really about a father trying to save his daughter from becoming him. She thought about Stephen on the tractor, about Anna's drawing about hands on an ignition key, and promises made and broken, and maybe possibly kept after all. "Do it. Pull everything. I want documentation so thorough that even Richard's own lawyer won't be able to defend him." Laura smiled, the first real smile Rebecca had seen from her in days. "Now, you sound like a CEO." The next 2 days passed in a blur of work and worry. Stephen went through his routines mechanically, feeding horses and fixing fence and making Anna's lunches, but the life had gone out of it. The quiet that had once been his refuge now felt oppressive, pressing down on him like physical weight. Wednesday afternoon, he tried to start the Ford 8N for the weekly maintenance Catherine had taught him to do without fail. The key turned, the engine cranked. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. The fuel pump had failed a part that had been on its last legs for months and had finally given up completely. Stephen sat in the tractor seat, the steering wheel under his hands, and felt something break inside him. This tractor was Catherine's heartbeat. Keep it running and they keep living. He had kept it running for 4 years, had maintained it with religious devotion, had polished the red paint until it gleamed. And now it would not start. Could not start, was broken in a way that would take parts he did not have, and time he could not spare, and expertise he had lost somewhere in the past 4 years of just trying to survive. He put his head down on the steering wheel and did not cry, but only because he had forgotten how. Pamela found him there 20 minutes later. She had let herself in through the kitchen door, calling his name following the sound of nothing, until she reached the barn and saw her son sitting in his dead wife's tractor, with his shoulders hunched and his whole body language screaming defeat. She did not ask what was wrong. She knew. She climbed up onto the tractor and sat on the fender beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and said the same thing she had said to him 1,000 times since he was small. "You're doing it again." Stephen lifted his head. Doing what? Calling it protecting Anna. But really, you're protecting yourself. That little girl doesn't need a father who's too scared to live. She needs a father who shows her that love is worth the risk, even when it hurts. Stephen's voice came out raw. "He could take her from me." "No, he couldn't. He's bluffing. Men like Richard Hastings don't actually go to court, they just threaten to. Because courts require evidence and testimony, and he has neither. What he has is fear, and he's using it like a weapon because that's the only weapon that works on good men like you." Stephen looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw in her face something he had forgotten existed: absolute certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from having lived long enough to know the difference between real danger and manufactured terror. "What if you're wrong? Then we'll deal with it, together, but I'm not wrong. And even if I were, even if the worst happened, you'd still have me, and you'd still have Anna on weekends, and you'd still have a life worth living. But if you walk away from Rebecca now, if you let Richard win by doing nothing except scaring you, then you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been." And that, Stephen, is no way to keep a promise to someone you loved. She climbed down from the tractor, brushed hay from her jeans, looked back at him. "Catherine told you to keep it running. She didn't mean the tractor. She meant your heart. So fix the damn fuel pump and fix yourself while you're at it." Thursday afternoon, Anna's teacher handed Stephen a drawing from Free Period. 3 people standing in front of a house: a tall man, a small girl with yellow hair like Anna's, and a woman with long dark hair like Rebecca's. The teacher had written a note at the bottom in careful cursive. "Anna says the woman is Daddy's friend, who smells nice and is scared of horses." Stephen sat in his truck in the school parking lot and looked at the drawing for a long time. The woman in the picture was smiling. So was the man. So was the girl holding both their hands. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, right over his heart, where he would feel it every time he moved. Then he took out his phone. He did not call Rebecca. He called Laura. Her voice was surprised when she answered. "Stephen, what time is her birthday?" A pause. Then, tomorrow. March 30th. Why? What time does she usually wake up? She hasn't slept in 2 days. She's been compiling evidence against Richard, trying to build a case strong enough to present to the board, even without the marriage going through. Stephen closed his eyes, opened them, made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff and trusting that the ground would catch him. "Tell her I need to see the farm one more time. Dawn. Stephen, the board meeting is at 2 in the afternoon. She can't— Dawn, Laura, make sure she's there." He hung up before she could argue, drove home, carried Anna inside, made her dinner, read her a story, kissed her goodnight. Then he went to the barn and spent the next 6 hours replacing the fuel pump on the Ford 8N by the light of 2 work lamps and sheer stubborn determination. His hands were covered in grease. His back ached from lying on the concrete floor. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. But when he turned the key at 2 in the morning, the engine caught and held rumbling to life with a sound like thunder, like a heartbeat, like a promise finally kept. He shut it off, cleaned his tools, went to bed for 3 hours, woke before dawn, and drove the tractor out to the north pasture, where the fog was just starting to lift and the apple trees were barely visible through the gray light. He cut hay in straight rows that would dry for 3 days before being baled. He worked steadily, methodically, not thinking about anything except the feel of the steering wheel under his hands and the sound of the engine that had been silent for 4 days and was now running stronger than it had in years. He saw the Audi when it was still half a mile away, black against the pale morning, and he did not stop working. He finished the row he was cutting, brought the tractor to the fence line, shut off the engine, climbed down and stood there with hay dust on his shoulders and grease still dark under his fingernails despite the shower he had taken at 4 that morning. Rebecca crossed the field toward him in heels that sank into the soft earth, her cashmere coat catching on wild grass, her perfect hair already coming loose from its pins. She stopped a few feet from the fence. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was something that sounded like a woman who had spent 2 days without sleeping and was running on nothing but will and coffee. "I'm not here to ask you anything. I just wanted to see this place one more time." She paused, swallowed, continued. "I need a husband by tomorrow, but I'd rather lose the company than lose whatever this was." Stephen stepped forward. His hands were dirty. There was hay on his sleeve and mud on his boots from where he had climbed down from the tractor, and he looked at her without caution, without the careful distance he had maintained for 4 years, and said the words that would change everything. "Then kiss me right now." Rebecca did not move. Behind her, Laura made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a laugh, her tablet nearly slipping from her hands. The driver in the Audi fumbled with his phone, trying to capture what was happening through the windshield, and failing because some moments are too large for screens. Stephen spoke again, his voice low and certain, carrying across the space between them like something physical. "Not for the contract, not for the board, not for your uncle. If we're doing this, I need to know it's real. So kiss me, and mean it." She stepped forward and kissed him. In the apple orchard in the early Vermont light, with fog still curling through the trees and Dutch watching from his stall with mild equine disinterest. Her hands gripped the front of his flannel shirt, the fabric rough under her palms smelling like diesel and hay, and the earth he had been working since before sunrise. His hand came up to the side of her face, calloused fingers against her cheek, and the world narrowed down to just this 2 people who had been running from different kinds of pain, finally standing still long enough to recognize each other. When they pulled apart, she was crying. He was not, but his eyes held something that looked like relief, like a man who had been holding his breath underwater for 4 years and had just broken the surface. "I fixed the tractor last night, spent 6 hours on my back replacing the fuel pump." Catherine always said, if you can't fix something, you don't deserve to keep it. I think she meant more than just machinery. Rebecca touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "We have 4 hours to get married, and 3 hours to drive to Boston for a board meeting where your uncle is going to try to destroy both of us." "Then we better not waste time." They drove to Shelburne in the Ford 8N, all three of them, Stephen at the wheel, Rebecca beside him, Anna in her lap, because the tractor only had one seat, and Anna had insisted on coming the moment she saw them heading for the barn. The engine rumbled beneath them steady and strong, and the 3 miles to Town Hall took 20 minutes at the tractor's top speed of 15 miles per hour. Locals stopped on the sidewalk to stare. Mrs. Henderson from the general store waved from her porch. 2 teenagers in a pickup truck pulled over to let them pass, one of them filming on his phone. The video destined to go viral by evening. CEO Mary's farmer arrives on antique tractor. The town hall was a small white building with a flag out front and a parking lot that held 6 cars on good days. Stephen parked the tractor in a space marked official vehicles only and helped Rebecca down. Then Anna, who was bouncing with excitement that had nothing to do with understanding what was actually happening and everything to do with the fact that Daddy had driven the special tractor that Mommy used to drive, and Rebecca was there, and Grandma Pamela had promised cookies after. Joyce Bartlett was the town clerk, a woman in her late 60s who had worked in this building for 43 years and had processed every birth certificate, death certificate, and marriage license in Shelburne since 1983. She looked up when they walked in, saw Stephen in a flannel shirt that was cleaner than his work clothes, but still obviously not formal, saw Rebecca in jeans and a white blouse, saw Anna carrying a purple aster she had picked from the roadside, with a stem bent at an angle that made the whole flower list to one side like a ship in rough seas. Joyce smiled the kind of smile that comes from having lived long enough to recognize love when she sees it, even when it shows up covered in hay dust and running 20 minutes late. Pamela called ahead, said you'd be coming, said you'd found light again after a long dark. She wasn't wrong. The ceremony took 11 minutes. There was no music, no photographer, no reception planned. Just the vows that had been written by someone decades ago and spoken by thousands of couples, since words that sounded different every time, depending on who was saying them and what they meant by them. When Joyce reached the part about kissing Anna, giggled and clapped her hands, and Stephen kissed Rebecca softly, carefully, like something that mattered more than he knew how to express. Pamela appeared from the hallway, where she had been waiting, dressed in the navy blue dress she saved for occasions that demanded acknowledgement. Easter services, funerals, weddings that changed the trajectory of her son's life. She was crying before she reached them, pulling Stephen into a hug that lifted him slightly off the ground, despite the fact that he was 6 inches taller than her and outweighed her by 80 pounds. Your father would have been so proud. Then she hugged Rebecca, held her at arm's length, looked at her the way mothers look at people who matter to their children. You take care of my boy, and if Richard Hastings gives you trouble, you call me. I know people. They took one photo in the parking lot. Pamela's phone had a cracked screen protector she refused to replace because it still worked fine, and replacing things that still worked was wasteful. Stephen stood with his arm around Rebecca's waist. Rebecca held Anna's hand. Anna clutched the aster like a scepter, like proof of something she could not name, but recognized anyway. Behind them, the red tractor gleamed in the noon sun, Catherine's heartbeat still running strong. Laura's call came before they made it back to the farm. Her voice was tight with controlled panic. Richard's at the office. He scheduled a press conference for 1:30. He has documentation, he has photos, he has a narrative ready to go. He's going to tear you apart in public, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. Rebecca checked her watch, 12:47. Boston was 3 hours away under normal conditions. Longer if traffic was bad, impossible if they stayed to argue about logistics. We're leaving now. Tell the board we'll be there by 2. Rebecca, that's not enough time. It'll have to be. Stephen was already moving toward the Audi. Anna ran to Pamela, who scooped her up without hesitation. I'll keep her here. You two go save the world. The drive was faster than it should have been Laura behind the wheel because Rebecca needed to review documents, and Stephen had never driven in Boston traffic and was not about to start now. They made it to the city in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The skyline rising ahead of them like a wall of glass and steel that had nothing to do with apple orchards or antique tractors or promises made to dying wives. The sidewalk in front of Hastings Development Headquarters was crowded with reporters and camera crews by the time they arrived at 1:58. Richard stood behind a podium that had been set up with careful staging, the company logo behind him, his expression grave and concerned, the performance of a man reluctantly doing the right thing, even though it pained him. He was midway through his presentation when the Audi pulled up to the curb. Rebecca stepped out in the same jeans and white blouse she had worn to get married, her hair windblown from the drive, her heels left behind in favor of the flats she kept in her office for days when meetings ran long. Stephen emerged beside her in his flannel and work boots, looking so profoundly out of place among the glass and steel that several reporters lowered their cameras just to stare. Richard's voice faltered for half a second when he saw them, then recovered with the smoothness of a man who had spent 40 years learning to hide what he was really thinking. As I was saying, my niece has engaged in a pattern of behavior designed to circumvent the legitimate terms of my brother's will. She has made multiple trips to rural Vermont over the past month. She has entered into an arrangement with a man completely disconnected from her professional and social circles. The evidence speaks for itself. He gestured to the screen behind him, where photographs appeared Rebecca's car outside Stephen's farm, time-stamped and dated. Receipts from the rental car company. Phone records showing calls between Rebecca and Laura discussing the Vermont situation. It was thorough professional and absolutely damning if you did not know the context behind any of it. A reporter shouted from the crowd, "Mr. Taylor, is it true you were offered $250,000 to marry Rebecca Hastings?" The crowd went quiet. Cameras swiveled from Richard to Stephen, waiting for the denial, the outrage the standard response of someone caught in a scandal. Stephen stepped forward. No one had invited him to speak. No one had prepared remarks for him or coached him through talking points. He simply walked past Rebecca, past the podium where Richard stood with his practiced smile starting to crack at the edges, and faced the cameras. "Everything he just told you is true. She came to my farm 4 weeks ago with an offer, a business arrangement, a contract. She offered me $250,000 to marry her for 12 months. The murmur that went through the crowd was like wind through trees, low and dangerous. Stephen let it pass. I said no. Silence. I turned down every dollar, because I don't take payment to pretend to be something I'm not. He told them who he had been an engineer from MIT, a man who had worked in towers like this one, who had worn suits and sat in conference rooms and calculated load-bearing weights for buildings that would stand for a century if the numbers were right. He told them who he was now, a farmer in Vermont, a father raising a daughter alone, a man who had given up everything when his wife got sick, because being with her mattered more than any career could. After Catherine died, I stayed on her family's farm, not because I couldn't go back to Boston, because I chose not to. I chose the quiet and the hard work, and the life where the most important thing I do each day is make sure my daughter knows she's loved. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Anna's drawing, unfolded it carefully, held it up so the cameras could see 3 people in front of a house, rendered in bright crayons, with all the confidence of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned that some things are complicated. My daughter drew this at school last week. That's me, that's her, and that's the woman she calls Daddy's friend who smells nice and is scared of horses. I'm standing here because I don't want to tell Anna that the woman in her picture isn't real. Because she is real. Because what we have is real, even if it started in a way that looks suspicious from the outside. He lowered the drawing, looked directly into the nearest camera. Rebecca Hastings didn't buy me. She couldn't. Because what I wanted wasn't for sale. I wanted someone who would sit on my porch at night without checking her email every 5 minutes. Someone who would let my daughter teach her about horses, even though she was terrified of them. Someone who would learn to start my dead wife's tractor and not feel like she was replacing anyone, because you can't replace someone who's gone. You can only make room for someone new. The reporters had stopped writing. Several of them were openly crying, which was unprofessional and entirely human, and exactly what Stephen had counted on people respond to truth when it's offered without agenda. Richard's face had gone pale. He stepped back to the microphone. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation. Rebecca cut him off. She moved to the podium with the precision of a woman who had spent a decade commanding boardrooms full of men who underestimated her, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do and not caring about the consequences. My uncle is correct that I entered into an arrangement that became a marriage. What he failed to mention is why my father included that clause in his will. She pulled out her phone, connected it to the screen behind the podium, displayed an image of a handwritten letter on William Hastings's personal stationery, dated 3 months before he died. This was found in my father's safe deposit box last week. I'm going to read it to you now. Her voice was steady, professional, the CEO presenting evidence to a hostile board. Rebecca works too hard, loves too little, like I did, like I regret. If she finds someone worth marrying before 33, she's learned to balance work and life the way I never could. If not, maybe Richard's learned compassion in the years since I caught him stealing from the Atlantic Heights project. But I doubt it. Either way, the company goes to whoever has grown the most. My money is on Rebecca. It always was. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's lawyer leaned in, whispered something urgent. Richard waved him off, trying to recover. That letter proves nothing. Anyone could forge. The letter has been authenticated by 3 independent handwriting experts. I have their reports. I also have documentation of $4.2 million you've embezzled from Hastings Development over the past 18 months. She pulled up a spreadsheet, let it fill the screen. Line after line of transactions that added up to theft on a scale that would send a man to prison for a decade if proven. Fake vendors, offshore accounts, inflated project costs that went straight into your pocket. The Atlantic Shores deal alone accounts for $1.8 million paid to companies that don't exist. Would you like me to continue? Richard's face had gone from pale to gray. His hands gripped the edges of the podium. This is fabrication. You're desperate. You're creating false evidence to cover your fraudulent marriage. Donna Jackson stepped forward from where she had been standing at the edge of the crowd. She was 70 years old, had been on the Hastings Development Board since William founded the company in 1987, and had exactly zero tolerance for men who thought they could lie their way out of consequences. The board received copies of this documentation yesterday. We've spent the past 24 hours reviewing it with our forensic accountant, a former FBI agent who specializes in corporate fraud. His assessment is that the evidence is not only authentic, but would be sufficient for criminal prosecution. She turned to face Richard directly. Effective immediately, you are removed from the board of Hastings Development. We are referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. Security will escort you from the building. Do not contact Rebecca. Do not contact any board members. And if you have any assets you are planning to move offshore in the next 72 hours, I suggest you reconsider. 2 security guards appeared as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment. Richard looked at them, looked at Rebecca, looked at the cameras that were recording every second of his professional destruction. He opened his mouth to say something, thought better of it, and walked away flanked by security with his lawyer trailing behind, making frantic phone calls. The reporters erupted with questions, all of them shouting at once, none of them getting answers, because Rebecca had already turned away from the podium and Stephen had taken her hand, and they were walking toward the building entrance together, while Laura ran interference with the press. A reporter managed to break through the crowd, shoved a microphone in Rebecca's face. Miss Hastings, is the marriage legitimate? Rebecca stopped, looked at Stephen, looked back at the reporter. Yes. Did you marry to save the company? Stephen answered before Rebecca could his voice carrying across the crowded sidewalk. She married because I asked her to kiss me and mean it. Everything else is just paperwork. Inside the building, the board meeting lasted 15 minutes. Donna presented the forensic accountant's findings in excruciating detail. The vote to confirm Rebecca as permanent CEO was unanimous. The vote to pursue criminal charges against Richard was equally unanimous. The vote to throw a celebratory gala in Rebecca's honor was rejected by Rebecca herself, who informed the board she was taking the rest of the week off and would be available by email if anything burned down, but otherwise should not be contacted unless someone was actively dying. Laura drove them back to Vermont, arriving just as the sun set behind the mountains. Anna ran out to meet them, Pamela following at a more sedate pace, and Anna launched herself at Rebecca with enough force to nearly knock her over. "Did you beat the bad man?" Rebecca crouched down to Anna's level. "We did. Your daddy and I together." "Good. Grandma Pamela made cookies and she said we can't eat them until you got back, and I've been waiting forever, which is at least 2 hours." They ate cookies in the kitchen while Copper begged shamelessly, and Pamela told them about the phone calls she had been fielding all afternoon from townspeople who had seen the video of them arriving at town hall on the tractor and wanted to know if there was going to be a proper reception, because weddings without cake were bad luck, and she wasn't raising her grandson in a house cursed by lack of cake. A week later, the entire town gathered at the small church where Catherine's funeral had been held 4 years earlier. Pastor Jenkins, who had presided over that service, and remembered how Stephen had sat in the front pew with Anna on his lap and not cried because he was afraid if he started, he would never stop, announced that there would be a blessing ceremony for the newlyweds. The whole town came, farmers in their Sunday-best shopkeepers, closing early teachers bringing their families. Someone had organized a potluck in the church basement tables, groaning under the weight of casseroles and pies and 3 different versions of macaroni and cheese, because apparently no Vermont potluck was complete without at least 3. Pamela's quilting circle presented them with a quilt they had been working on since the wedding, Catherine's fabrics woven together with pieces from Rebecca's life, the muddy blouse from her second visit, a scrap from the white shirt she had worn to get married, even a small square cut from Stephen's flannel that Rebecca wore on cold evenings. The center square was embroidered with their wedding date and a small image of a red tractor. Anna carried it to them, struggling under the weight of it, but refusing help because this was important and important things you did yourself. She presented it to Rebecca with the kind of ceremony that only 6-year-olds can manage. "Grandma Pamela says Mommy's watching from heaven, and she's happy because you make Daddy smile again, and you're not scared of horses anymore even though Dutch is really big." Rebecca took the quilt with hands that shook slightly. She touched Catherine's apron fabric, the same fabric she had seen in Pamela's sewing room weeks ago, and she felt it break open behind her ribs, relief grief both in a way that hurt and healed simultaneously. "Thank you for sharing your mommy with me. I promise I'll take good care of both of you." Anna looked at her seriously, the way children do when they are weighing whether an adult is telling the truth or just saying what sounds good. "Do you promise? Like pinky promise?" Rebecca held out her pinky. Anna hooked hers around it, and that was a contract more binding than anything Rebecca had ever signed in a conference room. 2 weeks later, on Anna's 7th birthday, the farm filled with children from her school class. There was a piñata shaped like a horse that took 20 minutes and 6 different children to break open. There was cake that Rebecca had baked from a recipe Pamela provided, following the instructions exactly, and still somehow ending up with frosting that was too thick, and decorations that looked nothing like the picture but tasted perfect anyway. There were presents wrapped in paper. Anna chose herself purple with silver stars, because purple was her favorite color this week, and silver was her favorite color last week, and she couldn't decide, so she used both. At the end of the day, after the last child had been picked up, and the last piece of cake had been eaten, and the piñata debris had been cleaned up, Anna climbed into Rebecca's lap on the porch swing without asking, without hesitation, settling in like she had been doing it her whole life. "Can I call you something?" Rebecca's. Her heartbeat changed faster, harder, unsteady. "You can call me whatever you want, sweetheart." Anna was quiet for a moment, working through something in her head, the way children do when they are trying to find words for feelings that are bigger than their vocabulary. "I don't want to call you Mom, because that's what I called Mommy, and she's in heaven watching. But I want to call you something that means you're my mom too, because you are kind of. Like how Grandma Pamela is Daddy's mom and also my grandma, so she has 2 jobs, but they're both important." Rebecca's throat was too tight to speak. Stephen was watching from the doorway, his eyes suspiciously bright. Anna continued working through her logic. "So, what if I call you Rebecca Mom? Then Mommy knows you're different, but still my mom, and, I love you both, and Daddy knows I'm not confused, even though grown-ups worry about that a lot. Rebecca managed to speak past the knot in her throat. I think that's perfect. I think your mommy would think it's perfect too. Anna smiled satisfied and snuggled deeper into Rebecca's arms. Okay, Rebecca Mom it is. Can Rebecca Mom read me a story tonight? Rebecca Mom would love to. That night, after Anna was asleep and the house was quiet, Stephen found Rebecca sitting on the porch, wrapped in the quilt Pamela's group had made, staring out at the orchard, where fireflies were just starting to appear in the gathering dusk. You okay? She nodded, not trusting her voice yet. He sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. She's been thinking about that for days, practicing different names in her head, trying to figure out what felt right. I heard her talking to Copper about it yesterday, running through options like she was preparing for a presentation. Rebecca laughed, the sound wet and unsteady. She's your daughter. Of course she made a strategic plan. She's our daughter now, if you want her to be. Rebecca turned to look at him, this man who had lost everything, and built it back slowly, carefully with his hands and his heart, and a red tractor that refused to stop running. I want that more than I've ever wanted anything. 3 months later, in the full heat of summer, when the air was thick enough to swim through and the cicadas sang from every tree, Rebecca and Stephen stood in the north pasture while he taught her to drive the Ford 8N. She was terrified in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the weight of what the tractor represented 70 years of family history. Catherine's last request, the promise Stephen had kept, even when keeping it hurt. Clutch and ease the throttle gentle on the shift. Don't fight the machine work with it. His hands were over hers on the steering wheel, guiding but not controlling, letting her feel the way the tractor wanted to move. The engine rumbled beneath them, steady and strong, and when Rebecca let out the clutch too fast and the tractor lurched forward in a way that made her gasp. Stephen just laughed. That's exactly what I did the first time Catherine taught me. She said I drove like a Boston engineer trying to calculate the optimal gear ratio instead of just feeling it. They circled the pasture slowly, Rebecca's knuckles white on the wheel, her whole body tense with concentration. Anna ran alongside them, Copper barking and jumping, both of them treating the whole thing like the best entertainment they had seen in weeks. By the third lap, Rebecca had started to relax, had started to understand the rhythm of it, clutch shift, throttle repeat. By the fifth lap, she was smiling. By the seventh, she was laughing, her hair coming loose from its ponytail, her face flushed with heat and exertion and pure joy. When they finally stopped, she turned to Stephen with eyes that were bright and alive, in a way he had never seen in all their weeks together. Catherine would be proud I didn't crash her tractor. She would. She'd also probably point out that you're grinding the gears like you're trying to make them into powder, but she'd do it with a terrible pun about how you need to shift your attitude, and then she'd laugh at her own joke, even though no one else thought it was funny. Rebecca kissed him there in the tractor seat, with Anna making exaggerated gagging noises from the ground below, and Copper barking his opinion on public displays of affection. I wish I could have met her. You would have liked each other. She would have made fun of your shoes, and you would have rolled your eyes at her chemistry jokes, and within a week, you'd have been finishing each other's sentences. That afternoon, while Stephen fixed a section of fence that had been damaged in a storm the previous week, Rebecca and Anna worked in the garden. The plot had been neglected for 4 years, weeds taking over where vegetables used to grow, but Pamela had saved seeds from Catherine's plants in mason jars labeled in her careful handwriting, tomatoes 2022, beans 2022, squash 2022. Anna dug holes with a hand trowel, while Rebecca opened the jars and explained what each seed would become. These tomatoes were your mommy's favorites. Grandma Pamela saved the seeds every year since she died, so we could plant them again when we were ready. Anna looked at the small brown seeds in her palm, impossibly tiny things that would somehow become plants taller than she was. So, if we plant mommy's tomatoes, it's like she's still here growing things. Exactly like that. They worked in the soil together, sun warm on their backs, hands dirty and knees muddy, and when Stephen came to find them, an hour later they had planted 3 rows of tomatoes, 2 rows of beans, and 1 row of squash that Anna insisted on doing by herself, because she was 7 now, and 7 was old enough to plant squash without help. That evening, as autumn began to paint the edges of the leaves gold and amber and deep red, Stephen and Rebecca sat in the two wooden chairs on the porch. Catherine's flowers were blooming beside them for the 5th year in a row, purple and white, stubborn and faithful proof that some things return every year without anyone tending them if the roots go deep enough. Rebecca was wearing the flannel shirt that had become hers somewhere along the way, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, the smell of it less like Stephen and more like both of them together. She had a laptop balanced on her knees, reviewing a contract for a development in Providence, while the sun set over the mountains, and Stephen was reading a book about soil management he had borrowed from the library 3 weeks ago and kept renewing because he hadn't gotten past chapter 4. Anna's voice came from inside the house, high and imperious. "Stop being weird. The movie's starting." They looked at each other, smiled, stood. The laptop closed, the book marked with a receipt from the hardware store. They walked inside together, Stephen's hand finding the small of Rebecca's back in a gesture that had become automatic, reflexive, necessary. The living room was arranged exactly how Anna wanted it, her in the center of the couch, with Copper at her feet, his tail thumping against the floor in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. She had already started the movie some animated thing about a dog who learns to talk and uses his newfound power to negotiate better treats from his humans. Rebecca brought popcorn she had made, using Catherine's recipe, the one Pamela had taught her that involved butter and salt, and a specific timing that resulted in kernels that were perfectly crispy on the outside and tender in the middle. Stephen dimmed the lights. They settled on the couch on either side of Anna, who immediately put her head on Rebecca's shoulder and her feet in Stephen's lap, like she was claiming both of them, marking her territory, making sure everyone understood that this was her family and she was the center of it, and that was exactly how it should be. Halfway through the movie, Anna fell asleep. Rebecca felt the weight of her go heavier, heard the change in her breathing, looked over to find Stephen watching them both with an expression she could not quite read, but felt in her chest anyway. "What? Nothing. Everything. I don't know how to explain it." Rebecca shifted carefully, not wanting to wake Anna, and reached for Stephen's hand across the small space that separated them. Their fingers tangled together the same way they had that night on the porch weeks ago when everything was still uncertain and terrifying and new. "Try." Stephen was quiet for a long moment, watching the movie he was not really watching, thinking about words that had never come easily to him. 4 years ago, I thought my life was over. Not dying, but done. Finished. I thought I'd had my chance at happiness, and it had ended, and I was lucky to have had it at all. So I should just focus on Anna and the farm and getting through each day without falling apart. And then you showed up in heels and cashmere, asking me to marry you for money, and I said no because I thought you were just another thing that would hurt when it ended. He looked at her fully, his eyes catching the light from the television screen. But you weren't. You aren't. You're the thing that proved I was wrong about everything. Wrong about being done wrong, about not having room for anything new. Wrong about the best thing I could do for Anna being to keep her safe by keeping everything else out. Rebecca's eyes were wet. I showed up offering you money because I thought that's all I had to offer. I'd spent so long being the CEO, being William Hastings' daughter, being the woman who could negotiate anything and feel nothing. And you looked at me and said no, and I couldn't figure out if I wanted to scream or cry or kiss you right there in the mud. Which did you choose? All three eventually. They sat that way until the movie ended and the credits rolled and Copper got up to stretch and investigate whether there was any popcorn left in the bowl. Stephen carried Anna to bed while Rebecca turned off the television and locked the front door and performed all the small rituals of closing down a house for the night. When Stephen came back downstairs, she was standing at the window looking out at the barn where the red tractor sat in its bay, the overhead lights off, but the moonlight catching on the polished chrome and red paint. "Thank you." Stephen came to stand beside her. "For what? For fixing the tractor, for asking me to kiss you and mean it, for letting me be Rebecca Mom, for giving me a family when I thought I'd lost the only one I'd ever have." He pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arms around her waist, and they stood there watching the moon rise over the mountains. "Catherine would have liked you," She would have made some terrible joke about how I needed a woman who could actually cook, and you'd have fired back with something about how I needed a woman who understood load-bearing calculations, and she'd have laughed and said, "I like this one. Keep her." Rebecca turned in his arms to face him. "I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me now." "Good, because Anna's already planning to teach you how to ride Dutch next month, and Pamela's going to insist you join the quilting circle, and the whole town expects us to host the Harvest Festival in October, because apparently getting married on a tractor makes us local celebrities. I can handle quilting and harvest festivals. Not sure about riding Dutch. You learn to drive the tractor. You can learn to ride the horse. The tractor doesn't have opinions about where it wants to go. Neither does Dutch. He just has stronger feelings about expressing them." They went to bed in the room that had been Stephen's alone for 4 years and was now theirs together. The quilt Pamela had made spread across the mattress, Catherine's fabrics woven together with Rebecca's, in a pattern that made sense if you understood that some things do not replace each other, but coexist layered and complex and stronger for it. The last thing Rebecca saw before sleep took her was the view through the window, the orchard in moonlight, the barn with its doors open, and the red tractor sitting exactly where Stephen had parked it that afternoon, after teaching her to drive it, its engine cool, and its paint gleaming, and its promise still being kept every single day. Not just keeping it running, actually driving it somewhere that mattered.